The horse screamed in pain, and nobody in the grand stable moved fast enough except her. Elara Whitmore dropped the bucket she was carrying and ran toward the injured animal, her boots slipping on the wet stones. The stallion, a huge black beast named Ember, had caught his leg in a broken fence rail, and blood was already soaking into the hay beneath him. Two grooms stood frozen, afraid of the horse's size and fury, but Elara did not hesitate. She had grown up around horses her entire life. Her father had been a stable hand before her, and his father before him. She knew the language of fear in an animal's eyes, and she knew how to speak back to it with calm hands and a steady voice. "Easy now," she whispered, moving slowly toward Ember's head. "Easy, I know it hurts." "I know." The horse's ears flattened, and he tried to rear, but Elara did not step back. She placed her palm flat against his neck and kept her voice low and even, the way her father had taught her. Slowly, the animal's breathing began to slow. His wild eyes softened just enough for her to reach the tangled leg and begin working the rail free, wincing at the raw wound underneath but working with quick, practiced fingers. That was when she heard the voice behind her, sharp as a blade cutting through fog. "Who gave you permission to touch my horse?" Elara did not turn around immediately. She finished freeing the leg first, because the animal's pain mattered more than anyone's pride, including her own. Only when Ember was calm and steady on three legs did she rise and face the man standing at the stable entrance. She had never seen him this close before. Duke Riston Ashcombe was tall, dressed in a coat too fine for a morning stable visit, with dark hair pushed back from a face that looked like it had been carved from stone and rarely smiled. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, studied her the way a man studies something he cannot quite categorize. "He was hurt," Elara said simply. "Someone had to help him." "That is not an answer to my question." "Then my answer is that no one gave me permission, sir. I saw an animal suffering, and I acted. If you would rather I had stood back and watched him bleed while waiting for someone with the proper rank to arrive, I apologize. I did not think that was what you wanted." A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation that someone dared speak to him without trembling. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "You are the Duke of Ashcombe," Elara said. "And that horse is going to need a proper wound dressing before it becomes infected, so if you would like to keep talking, I suggest you do it while I fetch the salve." She walked past him without waiting for a response, leaving him standing there with his mouth slightly open, unaccustomed to being dismissed by anyone, let alone a stable girl in a patched wool dress. By the time she returned with the salve and clean cloth, the Duke had not left. He stood near the stall, watching Ember with an expression that was almost tender, though he quickly hid it when she approached. "You handled him well," he admitted, the words seeming to cost him something. "Most men on this estate are afraid of him." "He is not dangerous. He is scared. There is a difference." Elara knelt beside the horse's leg and began cleaning the wound with careful, gentle strokes. "Animals do not attack out of cruelty. People do that. Animals only attack when they believe they have no other choice." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, watching her work. "You speak as though you know something about people attacking out of cruelty." Elara glanced up at him, startled by how closely he was listening. "I speak as though I know something about fear," she said carefully. "That is all." He crouched down across from her, close enough that she could smell the crisp scent of his coat, something like cedar and rain. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "What is your name?" "Elara Whitmore, sir." "Whitmore," he repeated it slowly as though testing the shape of it. "Your father worked in these stables." "He did, before he passed 3 winters ago." "I am sorry." The word surprised her, coming from a man whose reputation around the estate was one of coldness and impossible standards. The other servants whispered that he had not smiled since his father's death made him duke at only 22 years old, that he ran the estate like a machine, efficient and joyless, that he had already turned away 3 young women his family had hoped he would marry because none of them, in his words, understood what it meant to run anything beyond a household budget. "Thank you," Elara said, tying off the bandage with a final, neat knot. He would be pleased his horses are still being cared for properly. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and found the Duke still watching her with that same unreadable expression. "You are not like the others here," he said. "I do not know what the others are like, sir. I only know how to do my work." "That is precisely what I mean." He straightened, brushing hay from his knees, his voice returning to its usual cool distance. "The others flatter. They curtsy too low and speak too softly, hoping I will notice them and lift them somewhere they do not belong. You argue with me over a horse. Would you prefer I let him die to spare your feelings?" For the briefest moment, something like amusement touched the corner of his mouth. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "No," he said, "I would not." He turned to leave, then paused at the stable door, looking back at her over his shoulder. "A word of advice, Miss Whitmore. Whatever ideas a girl like you might form about a place like this, let me save you the trouble of chasing them. You will work here. You will be paid fairly, and you will be treated with respect, because that is how I run my estate. But you will never rise beyond what you are. A stable hand's daughter does not become a lady, no matter how clever her hands or her tongue. You will never be a duchess. I say this not to be cruel, but because I have watched ambition ruin people who believed otherwise, and I would rather you save yourself the disappointment." The words landed like a slap, sharp and sudden, though Alara kept her face still. She had faced worse than a wealthy man's condescension. She had buried a father with her own 2 hands because there had been no money for anyone else to help dig the grave. She had gone hungry through 2 winters and never once let anyone see her cry about it. A duke's warning, however coldly delivered, was not going to break her. Instead, she smiled. It was not the smile of someone defeated. It was the smile of someone who had just been handed a challenge she had not asked for but would not refuse either. "Thank you for the warning, sir," she said, her voice steady and unbothered. "I will keep it in mind." He studied her for a moment longer, as though trying to determine whether she had understood him correctly, whether the smile was defiance or simple politeness. Then, apparently deciding it did not matter, he turned and walked out of the stable, his boots striking the stone floor in even, unhurried steps. Alara watched him go, then turned back to Ember, running a soothing hand down the horse's nose. "He thinks a warning will stop me," she murmured to the animal, who huffed softly in response. "From what exactly? I never said I wanted to be a duchess." But even as she said it, something had shifted inside her chest, small and strange, like a seed dropped into soil that had not expected to grow anything that year. It was not desire for a title. It was something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. Perhaps it was simply the desire to prove a proud man wrong. Perhaps it was something more dangerous than that. She finished her chores in silence, cleaning stalls and feeding the other horses, but her mind kept returning to the gray eyes that had studied her so intently, to the voice that had delivered a warning meant to crush any hope before it could take root. She thought about her father, who used to say that people who built walls that high usually did it, because they were afraid of what might happen if someone climbed over them. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the estate grew quiet, Alara sat outside the small cottage she shared with her mother, mending a torn sleeve by candlelight. Her mother, a tired but kind woman named Agnes, watched her with knowing eyes. "You met him today," Agnes said. "It was not a question." "Who?" "The Duke. I can see it on your face. You have the look of someone who has just been told something they intend to prove wrong." Alara laughed softly, surprised her mother could read her so easily. "He told me I would never rise beyond what I am, that a stable hand's daughter does not become a lady." Agnes set down her own sewing and studied her daughter carefully. "And what do you think of that?" "I think," Alara said slowly, "that a man who spends his energy warning people away from dreams they have not even spoken aloud is a man who is more frightened than he lets anyone see." "Be careful, my girl," Agnes said, though there was a small, proud smile tugging at her lips. "Dukes do not take kindly to being seen through." "I am not trying to see through him, mother. I am only trying to care for his horses and keep my position." but even as she said the words, she did not fully believe them. There was something about the exchange that had lit a small fire in her, something that had nothing to do with titles or wealth and everything to do with the fact that, for the first time in a long while, someone had looked at her, truly looked at her, and seen someone worth warning. 2 days later, a message arrived at the cottage, carried by a nervous young footman who seemed almost afraid to deliver it. The Duke's mother, the Duchess Dowager Miriam, required a new companion, someone who could manage her moods, understand horses well enough to accompany her on rides, and handle the chaos of a large household staff without losing her composure. The footman explained, stumbling slightly over his words, that Alara's name had been suggested. Suggested by whom? Alara asked, though she already suspected the answer, and the thought sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. The footman only shrugged and said that such matters were not his to explain, only to deliver, and that she was expected at the main house the following morning if she wished to accept the position. That night, Alara lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small room, turning the offer over and over in her mind like a coin she could not decide whether to spend. It was more money than she had ever been offered. It was also, she suspected, a chance to prove something to a man who believed her incapable of rising above her station. She thought of his warning again, "You will never be a duchess." She had not asked to be one. But something told her that this offer, whatever its true origin, was the first step of a much longer road, one that neither of them yet understood the shape of. In the morning, she rose before dawn, dressed in her cleanest gown, and walked the long path toward the main house, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something that felt disturbingly close to hope. The main house rose before her like a mountain made of stone and glass, far grander up close than it ever looked from the stable yard. Alara had passed by its outer walls 1,000 times in her life, delivering messages or fetching supplies, but she had never once walked through the front entrance meant for guests and family. Today, a stern housekeeper named Mrs. Prout led her instead through a side door reserved for staff, though even that felt like crossing into a different world. "The Duchess Dowager is particular," Mrs. Prout warned as they climbed a narrow staircase. "She has dismissed 4 companions in the last 2 years, one for laughing too loudly, one for not laughing at all. You will need patience, girl, and a thick skin." "I have both," Alara said, though her stomach tightened with nerves she refused to show. They reached a set of tall doors at the end of a long hallway, and Mrs. Prout knocked twice before pushing them open. The room beyond was filled with morning light, heavy curtains pulled back to reveal a garden view, and seated near the window in a high-backed chair was an older woman with silver hair pinned elegantly atop her head and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "So you are the stable girl," the Duchess Dowager said, studying Alara from head to toe without any pretense of subtlety. "My son mentioned you." Alara's heart skipped. He did. "He said you argued with him over a horse and showed no fear doing it. That is rare enough that I wanted to see it for myself." The Duchess gestured toward a chair across from her. "Sit. Let us talk." Alara sat, smoothing her skirts nervously, though she tried not to let it show. "What would you like to know, my lady?" "Everything," the Duchess said simply. "Tell me about your father. Tell me why you did not run when a stallion twice your size tried to kick you into the next county. Tell me why my son, who has not spoken more than 10 sentences to any woman outside our family in 3 years, spoke an entire paragraph to me about a stable hand's daughter." Alara felt her cheeks warm, though she kept her composure. "I do not know why he would speak of me at all, my lady. We hardly exchanged more than a few words, most of them unpleasant." "Unpleasant how?" Alara hesitated, then decided honesty was likely the safest path with a woman whose eyes seemed to see straight through excuses. "He warned me that I would never become a lady, no matter how capable I might be. He seemed to believe I harbored some secret ambition to rise above my station." To her surprise, the Duchess laughed, a short, sharp sound like a bell. "Did he now? And do you harbor such ambition?" "No, my lady, I only wish to help an injured animal." "And yet here you are, standing in my private sitting room, being considered for a position that would place you inside these walls every single day." The Duchess's eyes glittered with something like amusement. Funny how warnings so often plant the very seeds they claim to prevent. Alara did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and the Duchess seemed to approve of her silence more than any clever reply could have earned. "I am old," the Duchess continued, her tone shifting to something more businesslike. "My joints ache, my patience is thin, and I have buried a husband and watched my son grow cold and joyless in the years since. I need someone who will not simply agree with everything I say out of fear, someone who understands horses well enough to ride beside me, and someone with enough backbone to manage this household when I am too tired to do it myself. Do you think you are that person?" Alara straightened her spine, meeting the older woman's gaze directly. "I believe I am willing to try, my lady, and that I will not stop trying until I succeed." "Good answer," the Duchess nodded once decisively. "You start tomorrow, Mrs. Prout will show you your new quarters." And just like that, before Alara had fully processed the shift in her circumstances, her life had changed entirely. She was no longer simply the daughter of a dead stable hand, mucking out stalls for a wage that barely fed her family. She was now, in some strange and unexpected way, a member of the household staff at Ashcombe Manor, with quarters inside the main house and a position that placed her in daily contact with the very man who had warned her away from exactly this kind of rise. When she stepped out of the Duchess's sitting room, she found the Duke standing in the hallway, arms crossed, clearly waiting for her. "You accepted," he said, his voice carrying no warmth, only a kind of weary resignation. "Your mother offered me a position, and I accepted it. I did not realize I needed your permission as well." "You do not," he said quickly. "This house is not mine alone to command, whatever some might assume. My mother makes her own decisions, and she has clearly made this one." "Then why do you look as though you have swallowed something sour?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might simply walk away without answering. Instead, he said, "Because I meant what I told you in the stable. Kindness toward you now will only make the eventual disappointment sharper later. This household operates on rules, Miss Whitmore, rules of rank and expectation that have existed far longer than either of us. I would rather you understand that now, before you become too comfortable within these walls." "I understand perfectly well," Alara said, her tone calm despite the frustration building in her chest. "You believe I am here to chase some fantasy of becoming your equal. I am here because your mother needs help, and because the wage will allow my own mother to eat more than porridge through the winter. Nothing more." Something flickered across his face, an emotion she could not quite name, gone before she could study it further. "Then we understand each other," he said, and walked away without another word. Alara stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly, though whether from anger or something else entirely, she could not say. The following weeks proved harder than she had anticipated. The household staff, accustomed to a strict hierarchy, treated her with suspicion, unsure how to categorize a girl who ate meals with neither the servants nor the family, who spent her mornings walking beside the Duchess Dowager through the gardens and her afternoons managing linen inventories and scheduling conflicts among the household staff. Some of the younger maids whispered behind her back, certain she had used some unspoken charm to secure her position. Others simply ignored her, unwilling to risk associating with someone whose place in the household remained undefined. But the Duchess, sharp-tongued and demanding as she was, proved to be fair, and slowly Alara began to understand the rhythm of her new role. She learned which topics soothed the older woman's aching joints and which conversations sparked her temper. She learned to read the household's undercurrents, the small rivalries between the cook and the head housekeeper, the quiet resentment brewing among staff who felt overworked and underpaid. And slowly, carefully, she began to fix things, one small problem at a time, earning trust where suspicion had once lived. The Duke, for his part, seemed determined to avoid her entirely, and for the first 2 weeks, he mostly succeeded. She caught glimpses of him crossing the courtyard on horseback, or heard his voice carrying sternly through closed study doors as he handled estate business with tenants and merchants. But avoidance, she soon learned, was nearly impossible in a household as interconnected as this one. Their first true encounter after that hallway conversation happened during a violent autumn storm that knocked down half a fence line and sent two frightened horses bolting into the surrounding woods. The household staff scrambled in a panic, unsure how to proceed, torches flickering weakly against the driving rain. Ilara, without waiting for anyone's permission, grabbed a lantern and a length of rope and ran out into the storm before anyone could stop her. She found the first horse trembling beneath a fallen tree branch, and after nearly 20 minutes of patient coaxing, managed to lead it back toward the stable. The second horse, however, had bolted further into the woods, and by the time she located it, the storm had grown fierce enough that visibility had dropped to almost nothing. That was when she heard hoofbeats approaching, and through the sheets of rain, saw the Duke himself riding toward her, soaked to the bone, his usually composed expression twisted with something close to fear. "Are you insane?" he shouted over the wind, swinging down from his horse. "Running into a storm like this alone?" "Someone had to find him," Ilara shouted back, gesturing toward the frightened animal cowering nearby. "I could not simply stand by while he suffered out here." "You could have been killed." "A falling branch, a bolt of lightning, the horse himself in his panic could have trampled you." "But none of those things happened," she said, moving carefully toward the trembling animal. "Now, are you going to help me, or are you going to continue shouting at me while this poor creature freezes?" For a moment he simply stared at her, rain streaming down his face, something unreadable churning behind his gray eyes. Then, without another word, he moved to help her, and together, working in near silence broken only by the howling wind, they managed to calm the horse enough to lead it back toward the safety of the stable. By the time they reached shelter, both of them were soaked through and shivering, and the stable hands who had gathered there stared at the sight of their Duke, drenched and disheveled, working alongside the household companion as though they were equals. "You should not have gone out there," the Duke said quietly, once the horse was settled and the immediate crisis had passed. His voice had lost its earlier sharpness, replaced by something more exhausted, more human. "And you should not have followed me," Ilara replied, though there was no real anger in her tone anymore, only a strange, warm exhaustion. "But you did anyway." He did not answer that, and in the flickering lamplight of the stable, surrounded by the smell of wet hay and horse, something passed between them that neither of them fully understood yet, something neither warning nor rule could easily erase. "Thank you," he finally said, so quietly she almost missed it over the sound of rain still hammering the roof. "For finding him. He was my father's horse, the last one left from before he died." Ilara softened at that, understanding suddenly the depth of what could have been lost that night, and why the Duke had ridden out into such dangerous weather himself rather than sending someone else. "You are welcome," she said simply. "I understand what it means to lose the last piece of someone you loved." Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither of them looked away, the tension between warning and understanding stretching thin as a wire. Then Mrs. Prout's voice echoed from the courtyard, calling for lanterns and dry blankets, breaking the spell, and both of them stepped back from whatever moment had nearly formed between them, retreating once more into the safer roles of Duke and companion, master and servant, two people who had been warned, in one way or another, to expect nothing more from each other than exactly this. But as Ilara walked back toward her quarters that night, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, she could not stop thinking about the way his voice had cracked slightly when he spoke of his father's horse, or the way his eyes had lingered on hers a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Whatever wall he had built around himself, whatever warning he had issued in the stable weeks earlier, something in that storm had cracked it, however slightly. She did not yet know what that crack would mean for either of them, but she suspected, as she drifted toward an uneasy sleep, that the road ahead was going to be far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Winter arrived early that year, wrapping the estate in a thick blanket of frost that turned the gardens silver and made the long hallways of the main house feel colder than usual, despite the roaring fires kept burning in every room. Alara had grown accustomed to her new life by then, though accustomed did not mean comfortable. Every day still brought new challenges, new whispers among the staff, new moments where she had to prove, again and again, that she belonged inside walls that had never expected someone like her to walk through them. The Duchess Dowager, however, had grown genuinely fond of her, a fact that surprised everyone in the household, including Alara herself. Their morning walks through the frozen garden had become a ritual neither of them wished to abandon, even as the cold deepened. The older woman spoke more freely now, sharing stories of her own youth, of a marriage arranged for politics that had somehow, against all odds, grown into real affection over the years. "My husband warned me when we first married that I would never learn to love this estate the way he did," the Duchess said one frosty morning, her breath visible in the cold air. "He was wrong, of course. I came to love it more fiercely than he ever did. Warnings, my dear, are often simply fear wearing the mask of wisdom." Alara thought of the Duke's words in the stable, the ones that still echoed in her mind more often than she wanted to admit. "Do you think your son believes the things he says?" The Duchess gave her a knowing look. "My son believes he is protecting people from disappointment. What he does not yet understand is that some disappointments are worth risking if the alternative is a life spent never trying at all." Alara said nothing to that, though the words settled somewhere deep inside her chest, taking root alongside all the other things she had begun to feel, but had not yet found the courage to name. Her days had grown busier as the household prepared for the annual winter gathering, a grand event the Ashcombe family hosted every year, drawing nobility from across the region for several days of feasting, dancing, and careful political maneuvering disguised as pleasant conversation. Alara found herself responsible for countless small details, from coordinating with the kitchen staff on menus to ensuring guest quarters were properly prepared, and the sheer scale of the task left her exhausted by each day's end. It was during one such exhausting afternoon, while she was double-checking a long list of seating arrangements in the study, that the Duke entered unexpectedly, clearly not anticipating finding her there. "I did not realize you would be working in here," he said, pausing in the doorway. "Your mother asked me to review the guest list for the winter gathering. I can move to another room if my presence is inconvenient." "No," he said quickly, then seemed almost surprised by his own response. "Stay. I only came to retrieve some correspondence." He moved to his desk, and Alara returned her attention to the list before her, though she remained acutely aware of his presence across the room, the quiet rustle of papers, the occasional soft sigh as he read through whatever letters awaited him. "You have done well," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "With my mother, I mean. She has not seemed this content in years." Alara looked up, surprised by the unexpected compliment. "Thank you. She has been kind to me more than I expected." "She has a talent for seeing people clearly," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the room. "I suspect that is why she chose you." "And what do you see when you look at me?" The question left her lips before she could stop it, bold and unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. He seemed startled by the directness of it, and for a long moment he simply studied her, as though genuinely considering how to answer honestly. "I see someone who refuses to accept the boundaries she has been given," he finally said. "Someone who argues with dukes over injured horses and rides into storms without a second thought for her own safety. Someone who has made my household staff both more chaotic and more functional in the span of a few short weeks." Is that meant to be an insult or a compliment? "I am not entirely certain myself," he admitted, and something in his tone, some rare thread of vulnerability, made Alara's chest tighten with an emotion she was not ready to examine too closely. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, and a moment later, a young woman swept into the room without waiting for permission, her golden curls perfectly arranged, her gown clearly the product of the finest tailor's money could afford. Alara recognized her immediately as Lucinda, the Duke's cousin, a woman who had visited the estate several times since Alara's arrival, and had made her disdain for the new household companion abundantly clear through countless small cruelties disguised as polite conversation. "Riston, darling, there you are," Lucinda said, her eyes flicking toward Alara with a coolness that bordered on contempt before returning to the Duke with practiced warmth. "I was told you were reviewing correspondence, but I see you have found more interesting company." "Lucinda," the Duke said, his tone carrying none of the warmth she clearly hoped for. "What brings you here today? Can a cousin not simply visit family without needing a specific reason?" Lucinda's laugh was light and musical, though Alara detected the calculation beneath it. "Though I confess, Aunt Miriam did mention her new companion, and I found myself curious to meet the girl who has caused such a stir among the staff." "I am simply doing my work, my lady," Alara said carefully, refusing to let the woman's tone provoke her into an unguarded response. "Of course you are," Lucinda said, her smile sharp as a blade despite its outward pleasantness. "Everyone always is until they are not." The comment hung in the air, its meaning clear enough to make Alara's cheeks warm, though she said nothing further. The Duke, to his credit, frowned at his cousin's words, though he did not directly address them. "Was there something specific you needed, Lucinda?" he asked instead, his patience clearly thinning. "Only to discuss the seating arrangements for the winter gathering. I do hope you have reserved a proper place for me near the head table, as tradition demands for family." "The arrangements are being handled," the Duke said, gesturing toward Alara. "Miss Whitmore has the details." Lucinda's eyes narrowed slightly at the implication that a stable hand's daughter now controlled something as delicate as seating politics among the region's nobility, but she recovered quickly, offering Alara another sharp smile. "How efficient of you, cousin, to trust such matters to your mother's companion. I do hope she understands the proper protocols involved." "I have studied them thoroughly," Alara said evenly. "You will find your place appropriately honored, my lady." "I am certain I will," Lucinda replied, though her tone suggested she intended to verify that promise personally, and would not hesitate to make a scene if she found anything lacking. After Lucinda finally departed, trailing perfume and cold politeness behind her, the Duke let out a long breath, running a hand through his dark hair in obvious frustration. "I apologize for my cousin's behavior," he said. "She has always believed rank should be treated as armor rather than simply circumstance." "She is not wrong to be cautious," Alara said, though the words tasted bitter as she spoke them. "I am, after all, exactly what she believes me to be. A stable hand's daughter who has somehow found herself managing the seating arrangements for a room full of nobility." "You are considerably more than that," the Duke said, his voice suddenly firm, almost fierce in its conviction, surprising them both. "Whatever warnings I may have offered you weeks ago, I have watched you these past months, and I can say with certainty that Lucinda's cruelty says far more about her own insecurities than it does about your worth." Alara stared at him, stunned by the intensity of his words, so different from the cold warning he had delivered in the stable that first day. "That is a rather significant shift from the man who told me I would never rise beyond my station." He looked almost embarrassed by the reminder, his jaw tightening slightly. "Perhaps I spoke too hastily that day. Perhaps I was more concerned with protecting my own assumptions about how the world operates than with actually observing the person standing in front of me." "And now, what do you observe?" "Someone who continues to surprise me," he admitted quietly, "in ways I did not anticipate and am not entirely certain how to navigate." The air between them felt charged, heavy with words neither of them seemed ready to speak aloud. And for a long moment, Alara wondered what might happen if she simply closed the distance between them, if she allowed herself to lean into whatever strange current had been building between them since that stormy night in the stable. But before either of them could act on the moment, a servant appeared at the door with an urgent message regarding a delivery dispute in the kitchens, and the spell broke as quickly as it had formed, both of them retreating once more into their respective roles, the Duke to handle the estate's business, Alara back to her endless list of preparations for the gathering that was now only 2 weeks away. As the days passed and the gathering drew closer, Alara found herself thinking constantly about that moment in the study, replaying his words over and over, trying to understand what they meant, trying not to hope for something that still felt impossibly far out of reach. She threw herself into her work instead, determined not to let her growing feelings distract her from the responsibilities she had been trusted with. The night before the gathering was set to begin, Alara worked late into the evening, finalizing the last details with the head housekeeper, ensuring every guest room was properly prepared, every menu confirmed, every seating arrangement finalized despite Lucinda's repeated attempts to have hers adjusted to a more prominent position. By the time she finished, the household had gone quiet, most of the staff already asleep, exhausted from the preparations. She walked slowly through the darkened hallways toward her own quarters, her mind still racing through mental checklists, when she passed the study and noticed light spilling from beneath the door. Curious, and slightly concerned that something might be wrong, she knocked softly before pushing the door open. The Duke sat alone at his desk, surrounded by papers, a half-empty glass of amber liquid beside him, his usually composed appearance slightly disheveled, his dark hair falling loose across his forehead. "You are still awake," she said, stepping inside despite herself. "As are you," he replied, glancing up with tired eyes. "Though I suspect your reasons are considerably more noble than mine. I am simply avoiding sleep, which has proven rather elusive lately." "Why is that?" He hesitated, studying her for a long moment before answering. "Tomorrow, this house will fill with people who expect certain things from me. A proper match, eventually. A wife suited to my rank, someone who understands the political weight of every conversation, every alliance, every carefully worded compliment exchanged over dinner. It is exhausting, pretending to care about matters that feel increasingly hollow to me." "And what would you rather care about?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. "I find myself increasingly uncertain of the answer to that question, Miss Whitmore, and it troubles me more than I care to admit." Alara's heart pounded loudly in her chest, and she took a small step closer, drawn by something she could no longer fully resist. "Perhaps," she said softly, "the answer does not need to be complicated. Perhaps it is simply whatever or whoever makes the exhaustion feel worth enduring." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with unspoken possibility. Then, slowly, deliberately, the Duke rose from his chair and crossed the room until he stood directly before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cold winter night outside. "I warned you once," he said quietly, "that you would never be a duchess." "You did," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I find myself increasingly uncertain whether that warning was meant for you," he continued, "or whether it was simply a warning I gave myself, afraid of exactly this moment." Before either of them could decide what to do next, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, and they both stepped back quickly, hearts pounding, as a servant passed by without noticing anything amiss. The moment shattered as quickly as it had formed, leaving both of them standing awkwardly apart, breathing slightly unsteady. "I should return to my quarters," Alara said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "Yes," he agreed, though something in his tone suggested reluctance. "Of course." She turned to leave but paused at the door, looking back at him one final time. "For what it is worth," she said, "I do not think warnings are always meant to be obeyed. Sometimes they are simply meant to be understood and then set aside." She left before he could respond, walking quickly through the darkened hallways toward her quarters, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Whatever was building between them, whatever fragile thread had begun weaving its way through weeks of arguments and unexpected kindness, tomorrow's gathering would test it in ways neither of them could yet predict. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Lucinda's cold smile lingered as a warning of its own, A reminder that not everyone in that grand house wished to see a stable hand's daughter rise any higher than the position she had already claimed. The winter gathering began the next evening with a grandeur that left Alara momentarily breathless, despite having spent weeks preparing every detail herself. Carriages arrived one after another, delivering nobility dressed in silks and jewels that glittered under the light of 100 candles, filling the great hall with laughter and music, and the kind of effortless elegance Alara had only ever glimpsed from a distance. Her role during the event was to remain in the background, managing the flow of the evening, ensuring the kitchen kept pace with demand, resolving small crises before they became large ones, and generally making certain that nothing disrupted the Duchess Dowager's carefully planned celebration. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the fact that she had to remain invisible while doing it, slipping between rooms unnoticed, never drawing attention to herself among the glittering crowd of guests. She caught glimpses of the Duke throughout the evening, moving through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting guests with polite conversation that revealed nothing of the man she had spoken with in the study the night before. He looked every bit the powerful nobleman his title demanded, and watching him from across the room, surrounded by admirers and potential brides paraded before him by hopeful parents, Alara felt the distance between their worlds more sharply than she had in weeks. Near midnight, during a brief lull in her duties, Alara found herself standing near a side entrance to the ballroom, watching the dancers move gracefully across the polished floor. A young maid named Nora, one of the few staff members who had grown genuinely friendly with her over the past months, appeared at her side, breathless with excitement. "There is going to be a masked ball at Lord Grayson's estate tomorrow night," Nora whispered conspiratorially. "One of the visiting ladies mentioned it just now. Apparently every young noble in the region will attend, and given how close his estate lies to ours, several of our own household staff have been asked to assist with the event." "That sounds like considerably more work," Alara said, though she could not help feeling a small flicker of curiosity. "Actually," Nora continued, her eyes sparkling mischievously, "I was thinking we might attend, just for an hour, disguised as guests. Masked balls make it nearly impossible to tell a lady's maid from an actual lady, especially with everyone hidden behind masks. I have a spare gown that would fit you perfectly, one my mistress gave me years ago and never bothered to reclaim." Alara hesitated, aware of how reckless the idea sounded, how many things could go wrong if they were discovered. But something about the prospect of one single night, free from the weight of her position, free from Lucinda's cold judgments and the constant awareness of boundaries she was never meant to cross, appealed to her more than she wanted to admit. "1 hour," she finally agreed, "and only if we are certain no one will recognize us." The following evening, after completing her duties early with the Duchess's blessing, Alara found herself standing before a small mirror in Nora's quarters, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. The gown Nora had provided was a deep midnight blue, simple compared to the elaborate creations worn by true nobility, but elegant enough to pass unnoticed among a crowd of masked guests. A silver mask covered the upper half of her face, and her dark hair had been pinned into an elaborate style that transformed her appearance entirely. "You look like you belong there," Nora said, admiring her handiwork with obvious pride. "No one would ever guess you spent this morning managing linen deliveries." Lord Grayson's estate, when they arrived by borrowed carriage, glowed with warm light spilling from every window, and the sound of music drifted across the grounds as they approached. Alara's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and nervousness as they entered the grand ballroom, surrounded by masked figures whose true identities remained hidden behind elaborate disguises. For the first time in months, nobody looked at her with suspicion or condescension. Nobody whispered behind gloved hands about her humble origins. She was simply another masked guest among many, free to move through the crowd, to accept a glass of wine from a passing servant, to laugh at overheard conversations without worrying about her place in the room's invisible hierarchy. She had not expected to encounter anyone familiar, which made it all the more startling when a tall figure in a dark green coat and matching mask, approached her near the edge of the dance floor, something achingly familiar in the way he carried himself. "You seem to be enjoying the evening more than most," the man said, his voice sending an immediate jolt of recognition through her chest, despite the mask obscuring most of his face. She knew that voice, she would have known it anywhere. "I could say the same of you," she replied carefully, keeping her own voice slightly altered, testing whether he might recognize her in return. "May I have this dance?" he asked, extending a gloved hand toward her. Every instinct told her to decline, to slip away before her disguise could be compromised. But something reckless and bold, something that had been growing inside her for weeks, made her place her hand in his instead. "You may," she said simply, and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. They moved together through the steps of the dance with surprising ease, his hand warm against her waist, his gray eyes, visible even behind the mask, never leaving hers. Neither of them spoke for several long moments, simply moving together to the music, and Alara found herself wondering if he truly did not recognize her, or if some part of him already knew exactly who stood before him. "You dance beautifully," he said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the music. "Have we met before? There is something familiar about you that I cannot quite place." "Perhaps we have crossed paths," she said carefully, her heart racing. "Though I suspect you would remember me differently if we had met under other circumstances." "A riddle," he said, something like amusement coloring his tone. "I find myself intrigued despite the mystery, or perhaps because of it." They continued dancing, and as the music shifted into something slower, more intimate, he drew her slightly closer, and Alara felt herself sinking into the moment despite every warning bell ringing in the back of her mind. "Tell me something true," he said quietly, "something you would not normally share with a stranger." Alara considered the request carefully, aware of how dangerously close she stood to revealing herself entirely. "I once believed happiness was something reserved for people born into circumstances different from my own," she finally said. "Tonight, for the first time in a long while, I am beginning to wonder if that belief was wrong." Something shifted in his expression, though the mask made it difficult to read exactly what emotion crossed his features. "That is a rather profound truth for a masked ball," he said softly. "What changed your mind?" "Someone warned me once that certain dreams were impossible for someone like me," she said, choosing her words with careful precision. "But warnings, I have come to learn, often reveal more about the person giving them than the person receiving them." He studied her intently, and for a moment, Alara feared he had finally recognized her, that the careful disguise had failed to hide the truth of who stood before him. But instead, he simply pulled her slightly closer, his hand tightening gently around hers. "I hope whoever gave you that warning comes to regret it," he said quietly. "Because from where I stand, you seem entirely capable of achieving whatever you set your mind toward." The dance ended, and neither of them moved to step apart immediately, the air between them charged with something neither dared name aloud. But the moment was interrupted by a chiming clock somewhere in the great hall, its 12 strikes echoing through the ballroom, signaling that midnight, and with it Alara's promised departure had arrived. "I must go," she said quickly, panic rising as she realized how close she had come to being discovered, how dangerously she had allowed herself to be drawn into this stolen moment. "Wait," he said, reaching for her hand as she began to step away. "At least tell me your name." "Some things," she said, offering him a small, mysterious smile as she pulled her hand free, "are better left as mysteries." She turned and hurried through the crowd, weaving between masked guests until she found Nora waiting near the entrance, equally flushed from an evening of stolen freedom. "We need to leave now," Alara said urgently, pulling her friend toward the carriage. They rode home in breathless silence, Alara's mind racing through everything that had happened, the dance, his words, the way his hand had felt against hers, the terrifying possibility that he had recognized her despite everything. It was only the next morning, as she resumed her duties preparing for the final day of the winter gathering, that she learned the full truth of what had happened. She was arranging fresh flowers in the main hall when she overheard two visiting ladies gossiping near the staircase, their voices carrying easily across the empty space. "Did you hear? The Duke of Ashcombe attended Lord Grayson's masked ball last night, quite unexpectedly. He danced with a mysterious woman in blue and apparently could not stop asking about her identity afterward. Nobody seems to know who she was." Alara froze, the flowers slipping momentarily from her trembling hands. It had truly been him, and he had recognized her voice as familiar without connecting the truth, that the woman he had danced with, the woman whose words had lingered in his mind long enough to inspire gossip among the region's nobility, was the very stable Hand's daughter he had once warned would never rise beyond her station. Her heart pounded with a dizzying mixture of fear and exhilaration as she finished her work that morning, aware that the fragile secret could unravel at any moment, and equally aware that some part of her, dangerous and reckless, hoped it might. The final evening of the winter gathering arrived with a formal dinner meant to close the festivities, drawing together every remaining guest for one last elaborate display of hospitality before the visiting families departed for their own estates. Alara had spent the entire day managing preparations, her mind still distracted by the events of the previous night, by the memory of dancing in the Duke's arms without either of them fully understanding what they had shared. She had not seen him since the masked ball, and part of her wondered if he had begun to suspect the truth, though nothing in his brief, businesslike interactions with household staff that day suggested any change in how he perceived her. Perhaps, she told herself, the secret would remain safely buried, a single stolen memory neither of them would ever need to acknowledge openly. That fragile hope shattered entirely during the formal dinner itself. Alara had been assigned to oversee the evening from a discreet position near the edge of the dining hall, ensuring the meal proceeded smoothly and addressing any last-minute concerns from the kitchen staff. She stood quietly near a side door, watching the long table filled with nobility engaged in polite conversation, when Lucinda's voice suddenly rose above the general murmur, sharp and deliberate in a way that immediately drew everyone's attention. "I must say, cousin," Lucinda said, her eyes flicking meaningfully toward Alara before returning to the Duke seated at the head of the table, "I found it rather curious that a mysterious woman in blue managed to charm you so thoroughly at Lord Grayson's masquerade last night. The entire region seems to be speculating about her identity. Have you managed to solve the mystery yourself?" The Duke's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he attempted to wave the comment away with practiced ease. "It was simply a dance, Lucinda, nothing more." "Was it?" Lucinda pressed, her voice carrying a dangerous edge of satisfaction that immediately set Alara's nerves on high alert. "Because I happened to speak with one of Lord Grayson's maids this afternoon, who mentioned that two young women from our own household attended the masquerade uninvited, disguised in borrowed gowns." A ripple of interested murmurs spread through the assembled guests, and Alara felt her stomach drop as every eye at the table slowly began turning toward her, standing near the side door in her plain household uniform, suddenly the object of intense and unwanted scrutiny. "Surely," Lucinda continued, her voice dripping with false innocence, "that could not have been our own Miss Whitmore, could it? The stable Hand's daughter, dancing among nobility as though she belonged there." The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence, and Alara felt every muscle in her body freeze, trapped between the impulse to flee and the knowledge that running now would only confirm everyone's worst assumptions. The Duke's gray eyes met hers across the crowded dining hall, and Alara watched, with a sinking heart, as understanding slowly dawned across his features. The mysterious woman in blue, the familiar voice he could not quite place, the words about warnings and dreams that had lingered in his mind since the previous night. "Alara," he said slowly, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and something else she could not quite identify, "was that you?" There was no point denying it now, not with Lucinda's triumphant smile fixed firmly in place, not with every guest at the table waiting eagerly for her response. Alara straightened her spine, refusing to let her humiliation show despite the heat rising in her cheeks. Yes, she said clearly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. It was me. Gasps and murmurs erupted around the table, some guests scandalized, others clearly entertained by the unexpected drama unfolding before them. Lucinda's smile widened with satisfaction, delighted at having orchestrated exactly the humiliation she had intended. "How bold," Lucinda said, her tone dripping with false admiration that fooled no one. A stable-hand's daughter, dancing among nobility, deceiving an entire ballroom into believing she belonged among them. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, did you enjoy your brief taste of a life you were never meant to have? That is enough, Lucinda, the Duke said sharply, though the damage had already been done, the humiliation already complete. Is it? Lucinda pressed, undeterred. Because I believe the entire household deserves to know the truth about the woman managing their affairs. A woman who sneaks into masquerades under false pretenses, who dances with dukes while wearing borrowed gowns, clearly harboring ambitions far beyond her station, exactly as you warned her against yourself. Cousin, if the rumors from your own staff are to be believed. The reminder of his own warning, spoken so many months ago in the stable, landed like a physical blow, and Alara watched something complicated flicker across the Duke's face, embarrassment mixed with something that looked almost like guilt. I think, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, that this conversation has gone on long enough. Miss Whitmore's activities outside her official duties are not a matter for public discussion at my family's dinner table. But the words, though meant to defend her, carried an unmistakable edge of distance, of retreat back into formality and rank, and Alara felt the small connection they had built over the past months crumbling in real time before an audience of nobility eager to witness her downfall. Of course, Lucinda said sweetly, though her eyes glittered with triumph. I only meant to ensure everyone understood the situation clearly. The dinner resumed with strained, awkward conversation, but Alara could no longer bear to remain in the room, humiliation burning through her chest like fire. She excused herself quietly, slipping out through the side door before anyone could stop her, and made her way through empty hallways toward the small room she had called her quarters for the past several months. Once alone, she allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Manor, to cry. Not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion, out of the accumulated weight of months spent proving herself worthy of a place that clearly still viewed her as an outsider, no matter how hard she worked or how much genuine affection she had earned from the Duchess Dowager. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts some time later, and she quickly wiped her eyes before opening the door, expecting Nora or perhaps Mrs. Prout checking on her welfare. Instead, she found the Duke standing in the hallway, his formal dinner attire slightly disheveled, his expression unreadable. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. "I do not think that would be appropriate given tonight's revelations," Alara said, her voice still thick with unshed tears. "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but I would like to speak with you regardless if you will permit it." She stepped aside reluctantly, allowing him to enter the small room, suddenly acutely aware of how modest her quarters looked compared to the grandeur he was accustomed to. "I am sorry," he began, "for how tonight unfolded. My cousin's cruelty was unwarranted, and I should have addressed it more forcefully." "You defended me in your way," Alara said, though her tone remained guarded. "But you also reminded everyone, quite publicly, that you had warned me against exactly this kind of ambition. I heard the words behind your words, even if you did not intend them that way." He winced slightly at that, clearly recognizing the truth in her observation. "I did not mean it as an accusation. I was simply trying to redirect the conversation away from further embarrassment." "Perhaps," Alara said, "but the damage has already been done, regardless of your intentions. Everyone at that table now believes exactly what your cousin wanted them to believe, that I am a girl who forgot her place, who dared reach for something never meant to be hers." "And what were you reaching for?" he asked quietly. "At the masquerade, I mean. What did you hope to find there?" Alara considered the question carefully, aware of how much honesty this moment demanded, regardless of the risk involved. For one single evening, she said finally, I wanted to exist without the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me. I wanted to dance and laugh and simply be a woman enjoying music, without anyone questioning whether I belonged there. I did not go seeking you specifically, though I confess, once I realized who I was dancing with, I found myself unable to step away. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because for those few minutes, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly, you looked at me the way you looked at me tonight before you knew the truth, without judgment. Without the weight of rank and rules standing between us. I wanted to hold onto that feeling for as long as I possibly could. The Duke stood silently for a long moment, processing her words, something complicated warring behind his gray eyes. I meant what I said last night, he finally admitted. About hoping whoever warned you would come to regret it. I did not realize at the time that I was speaking about myself. Do you regret it now? Alara asked, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alara felt her hope, however small and fragile, begin to crumble entirely. I do not know, he finally admitted, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like defeat. I know what tonight's events mean for how the household will view us both moving forward. I know what my family, and the wider nobility, will expect from me. And I know that continuing whatever this is between us would create complications neither of us may be prepared to handle. The words, though gently delivered, cut deeper than Lucinda's cruelest remarks had managed, precisely because they came wrapped in genuine care rather than malice. Alara felt something inside her harden, a protective wall rising to shield herself from further disappointment. Then perhaps, she said quietly, your original warning was correct after all. I will never be a duchess, and I should stop allowing myself to imagine otherwise. That is not what I meant, he said quickly, reaching toward her before catching himself and letting his hand fall back to his side. Is it not? Alara asked, her voice steadier now, hardened by the sting of rejection wrapped in careful, considerate words. Because it certainly sounds like exactly what you meant. He did not have an answer for that, and his silence spoke louder than any words could have managed. Alara nodded slowly, accepting the truth of the situation with a composure that cost her every ounce of remaining strength. I think you should leave now, she said quietly. I have an early morning ahead of me, preparing for the departure of your remaining guests. He lingered a moment longer, as though wanting to say something more, something that might repair the damage already done. But eventually, he simply nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Alara alone once more with her thoughts, her humiliation, and the painful clarity of exactly where she stood in his eyes, and in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed her exposure that evening. She did not sleep that night, staring instead at the ceiling of her small room, turning over every possibility, every option available to her. She thought of her mother, waiting at home in their small cottage, and of the wages that had allowed them both to survive the harshest parts of winter. She thought of the Duchess Dowager, whose genuine affection had meant more to her than she had realized until this very moment. And she thought of the Duke himself, whose warning, delivered so coldly months ago, had somehow become the very thing standing between them now, exactly as he had intended it to. By the time dawn began breaking faintly through her window, Alara had made her decision. She could not continue serving in a household where her presence had become a source of scandal and division, where every interaction with the Duke would now carry the weight of unspoken words and impossible expectations. She would leave, quietly and with whatever dignity remained to her, before the situation could deteriorate any further. She began packing her few belongings before the household staff had even begun their morning duties, determined to depart before anyone could talk her out of the decision. Or worse, before the Duke could offer another carefully worded apology that changed nothing about the fundamental reality of their situation. The house remained silent as Alara moved through it one final time, her small bag packed with the few belongings she had brought with her months earlier, along with a modest sum of savings she had carefully set aside from her wages. She had written a brief letter to the Duchess Dowager, thanking her for her kindness and explaining, as gently as possible, that circumstances made it necessary for her to seek employment elsewhere. She left it on the small writing desk in her quarters, knowing the older woman would understand more than most exactly why she felt compelled to leave. The cold morning air bit sharply as she made her way toward the stables, where she intended to say a final goodbye to the horses she had cared for during her time at Ashcombe Manor, and perhaps arrange for transportation to the nearby town, where she hoped to find new employment. The estate remained mostly asleep, the sky still holding onto the last traces of night, and Alara moved quietly through the darkened grounds, grateful for the solitude that allowed her to process her emotions without an audience. Inside the stable, she found old Callum, the elderly stable master who had worked alongside her father for decades, already awake and tending to the horses despite the early hour. "You are up early, girl," he said, glancing up from his work with knowing eyes that seemed to understand immediately that something significant had shifted in her circumstances. "Or perhaps you have not slept at all." "I am leaving Callum," she said simply, no point in hiding the truth from a man who had known her since childhood. "This morning before the household wakes." Callum studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though he had expected this news eventually. "The gathering," he said. "Word travels fast among the staff. That cousin of his has a talent for cruelty dressed up as concern." "It is not only that," Alara admitted, though she did not elaborate further, unwilling to voice the deeper complications involving the Duke himself. "I simply believe it is time for me to find a different path." "The roads are dangerous this early, and cold besides," Callum said, his weathered face creasing with genuine worry. "At least let me lend you a proper coat. That thin cloak of yours will not survive the journey to town." He disappeared briefly into a small storage room and returned carrying a heavy wool coat, clearly meant for a man, worn but sturdy, the kind of practical garment stable hands wore during the coldest months of winter work. "It was your father's," Callum said quietly, placing it gently into her hands. "I kept it after he passed, thinking perhaps you might want it someday. This seems as good a day as any." Alara's eyes filled with unexpected tears as she accepted the coat, running her fingers over the worn fabric, imagining her father wearing it during countless early mornings just like this one, tending to horses in the cold before the rest of the world had woken. She slipped it on over her dress, and though it hung slightly large on her smaller frame, it felt like an embrace from someone she desperately missed. "Thank you, Callum," she said softly, "for everything." "Take the gray mare," he said, gesturing toward a gentle horse near the back of the stable. "She knows the road to town well, and will carry you safely there." As Alara prepared the horse, checking the saddle and adjusting the stirrups with practiced efficiency, she heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the main house, hurried and urgent enough to make her pulse quicken with sudden apprehension. She turned just as the Duke appeared at the stable entrance, still dressed in the same clothes from the previous night, clearly having not slept either, his dark hair disheveled, and his expression a mixture of exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like panic. "You are leaving," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual composed authority, instead sounding raw and unguarded in a way she had never heard from him before. "Yes," Alara said simply, continuing her preparations despite the way her hands had begun trembling at his unexpected arrival. "I believe it is best for everyone involved." "Best for everyone, or best for you?" he asked, stepping further into the stable, his gray eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that made it difficult for her to concentrate on the simple task of securing the saddle. "Does it matter?" she asked, finally turning to face him directly. "You made your feelings clear last night. Continuing whatever existed between us would create complications you are not prepared to handle. I am simply removing myself from the equation before those complications can cause further damage." "That is not what I meant," he said again, echoing his words from the previous night, though this time his voice carried more urgency, more desperation to be properly understood. "I was afraid, Alara. afraid of what it would mean for both of us if I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what I have been feeling since the day you argued with me over an injured horse. Fear is not a good enough reason to let something meaningful slip away, Alara said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the emotion she was trying so hard to keep controlled. Believe me, I understand fear intimately. I have lived with it my entire life, fear of poverty, fear of losing everything, fear of never being seen as anything more than my circumstances suggest I should be. But I have never allowed that fear to stop me from trying, from hoping, from reaching toward something better, even when everyone around me insisted it was impossible. I know, he said quietly, closing the distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she chose to. That is precisely what draws me to you, Alara. Your refusal to accept the boundaries everyone else insists upon. I told you once that you would never be a Duchess, and I meant it as a warning to protect you from disappointment. But I have come to realize, over these past months, that the warning was never truly about you at all. Then who was it about? She asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Myself, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I was afraid of exactly this moment, afraid of caring for someone so deeply that losing them would break something inside me I have spent years carefully protecting since my father's death. It was easier to build walls, to insist on rules and boundaries, than to risk the vulnerability of genuinely caring for another person. Alara felt her resolve wavering, the careful walls she had constructed around her own heart beginning to crack under the weight of his honesty. That does not change the reality of our situation, she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. Your family, your position, the expectations of your entire world, none of that has changed simply because you have decided this morning to speak honestly about your feelings. You are right, he agreed. None of that has changed. The obstacles remain exactly as significant as they were yesterday, exactly as significant as they were the day I first warned you against hoping for something impossible. But I find myself no longer willing to let those obstacles determine my choices, regardless of how complicated navigating them might prove. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step away, and gently took her hand in his touch warm despite the cold morning air surrounding them. I am not asking you to stay because it will be easy, he said softly. I am asking you to stay because I have come to understand, far too late perhaps, that some things are worth the difficulty they bring. You once told me that warnings often reveal more about the person giving them than the person receiving them. You were right. My warning revealed my own fear, not any truth about your worth or your capabilities. Tears slipped silently down Alara's cheeks, though whether from lingering hurt or overwhelming relief, she could not entirely distinguish. Lucinda will not stop, she said quietly. Others like her will continue trying to remind everyone, at every opportunity, exactly where they believe I belong. Let them try, the Duke said, his voice firm with a conviction she had never heard from him before. I have spent years allowing other people's expectations to dictate my choices. I am done doing so, particularly when it comes to someone this important. For a long moment, Alara simply stood there, his hand wrapped around hers, the weight of her father's coat settling around her shoulders like a comforting embrace, the gray mare shifting patiently behind her, ready for a journey that suddenly felt less certain than it had only moments earlier. I still intend to leave this morning, she finally said, and watched his expression falter slightly before she continued. But not because I am running from what exists between us. I need time, away from this household, away from the constant scrutiny and judgment, to understand my own feelings clearly, without the pressure of everyone watching and whispering about every choice I make. Where will you go? He asked, though he did not try to stop her, seeming to understand the necessity of what she was proposing. To town, she said. I have some savings and skills that should allow me to find honest work while I sort through everything that has happened these past months. I will not disappear entirely if that is what concerns you, but I need this distance, at least for a while. He nodded slowly, clearly reluctant but respecting her need for space and clarity. "Then I will not stop you," he said. "But I ask that you allow me to know you are safe, and that you consider, when you are ready, whether there might be a path forward for us that neither of us has yet imagined." "I will consider it," she promised, and meant it sincerely, despite the uncertainty still clouding her heart. She mounted the gray mare, adjusting her father's coat around her shoulders against the biting morning cold, and looked down at the Duke standing in the stable doorway, his expression a complicated mixture of hope and reluctant acceptance. "Goodbye for now," she said softly, and before he could respond, before either of them could second-guess the moment further, she smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that held more warmth than sadness, and turned the mare toward the estate's main road, riding away into the pale light of dawn breaking over the frosted hills. Behind her, the Duke remained standing in the stable doorway, watching until she disappeared entirely from view, the warning he had once offered her now feeling like a distant memory belonging to a version of himself he no longer fully recognized. Elara rode steadily toward town, the cold wind biting at her cheeks, her father's coat providing just enough warmth to make the journey bearable. Despite the uncertainty ahead, despite leaving behind a household that had become, despite everything, something close to a second home, she felt lighter than she had in weeks, as though riding away from Ashcombe Manor had lifted a weight she had not fully realized she was carrying. She did not know, as the manor grew smaller behind her, exactly what the future held, whether the fragile understanding reached in that stable would survive the challenges still waiting ahead, or whether Lucinda and others like her would find new ways to undermine whatever connection had grown between a stable hand's daughter and a duke who had finally learned to question his own warnings. But for the first time since arriving at that grand estate, she felt entirely, unapologetically herself, free to determine her own path forward, regardless of what anyone else believed she deserved. The sun continued rising as she rode, casting golden light across the frosted countryside, and Elara allowed herself, finally, to simply breathe, to exist in the present moment without the weight of expectations pressing down upon her, and to hope, cautiously but genuinely, that whatever came next might prove worth every difficulty still ahead. The town of Ashford lay nestled at the base of the hills, considerably smaller than the grand estate Elara had left behind, but bustling with a different kind of energy entirely, merchants calling out their wares, children running through narrow streets, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a small bakery near the town square. Elara arrived just as the town was waking fully to its morning routines, and after securing temporary lodging at a modest inn run by a kind widow named Bate, she began the process of building a new life for herself, one entirely separate from the complicated world of dukes and duchesses she had left behind. Bate, it turned out, needed help managing her small stable of horses used for the inn's guest services, and Elara's obvious expertise with the animals quickly earned her a position, along with a small room above the stable that, while considerably more modest than her quarters at Ashcombe Manor, felt entirely her own in a way nothing at the estate ever had. "You have a gift with these creatures," Bate observed one afternoon, watching Elara calm a particularly nervous horse belonging to a traveling merchant. "Where did you learn such skill?" "My father taught me," Elara said, running a soothing hand along the horse's neck. "He worked as a stable hand his entire life, and passed his knowledge on to me before he died." A stable hand's daughter, working her way into a position of genuine skill and respect, Bate said approvingly. "That is no small accomplishment, my dear." The comment struck Elara more deeply than Bate likely intended, echoing so closely the very words the Duke had once used to warn her away from ambitions he believed impossible for someone of her station. Except here, in this small town, surrounded by people who judged her only by her competence and character rather than her birth, that same identity carried no shame, no limitation, only genuine respect earned through honest work. Word of her talent spread quickly through the small community, and within weeks, Elara found herself managing not only Bate's stable, but occasionally consulting for other local businesses struggling with difficult or injured animals. She began saving money carefully, dreaming of perhaps one day establishing her own small stable or veterinary service, something entirely her own, built on nothing but her own skill and determination. She thought of the Duke often during those weeks, though she forced herself not to dwell too heavily on those memories, uncertain whether the fragile understanding reached in that stable doorway would survive the distance and time now separating them. She had sent one brief letter to the Duchess Dowager, assuring her of her safety and thanking her again for the kindness shown during her time at the estate, but she had deliberately avoided any direct communication with the Duke himself, needing the space to fully understand her own feelings without his presence complicating her clarity. Meanwhile, back at Ashcombe Manor, the Duke found himself struggling with an emptiness he had not anticipated feeling so acutely. The household, though it continued functioning smoothly under Mrs. Prout's capable management, felt somehow diminished without Alara's presence, without her quiet competence resolving countless small crises before they could escalate into larger problems, without her willingness to challenge him when his own pride or stubbornness threatened to create unnecessary difficulties. His mother, the Duchess Dowager, noticed his growing restlessness immediately, and one evening, several weeks after Alara's departure, she confronted him directly during their evening tea. "You have been unbearable to be around lately," she observed, studying her son with the same sharp perceptiveness that had once seen through Alara's careful composure so quickly. "I assume this has something to do with a certain stable-hand's daughter who left us rather abruptly." "I do not wish to discuss it, mother," the Duke said, though his tone lacked its usual firm authority. "Nonsense," the Duchess replied briskly. "You have spent weeks moping about this house like a man who has lost something precious and refuses to admit it, even to himself. I raised you better than to let pride stand between yourself and genuine happiness." "It is not simply pride," he admitted finally, unable to maintain his usual reserve under his mother's persistent questioning. "The obstacles between us remain significant. My position demands certain expectations regarding marriage and family alliances that a match with someone of Alara's background would complicate considerably." "And do you believe those complications outweigh whatever you feel for her?" the Duchess asked pointedly. He hesitated, considering the question seriously for the first time since Alara's departure. "No," he finally admitted, "I do not believe they do." "Then why?" his mother asked, exasperation clear in her voice. "Are you sitting here drinking tea with your elderly mother instead of riding to town to tell her exactly that?" "She asked for time and space to consider her own feelings," he said. "I promise to respect that request." "Respecting her wishes is admirable," the Duchess said, softening slightly. "But there is a considerable difference between respecting someone's need for space and abandoning them entirely to wonder whether you have simply moved on and forgotten your promises. Perhaps a letter, at the very least, reminding her that your feelings have not wavered despite the distance." The Duke considered his mother's advice carefully over the following days, drafting several letters he ultimately discarded, uncertain how to properly convey the depth of his feelings without overwhelming Alara or pressuring her decision before she felt genuinely ready. Eventually, he settled on something simple and honest, avoiding elaborate declarations in favor of straightforward truth. Alara received the letter nearly a month after her departure from Ashcombe Manor, delivered by a young messenger who had clearly traveled considerable distance to locate her. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper, recognizing the Duke's precise, careful handwriting immediately. The letter was brief, containing no elaborate promises or dramatic declarations, simply an honest acknowledgement that his feelings remained unchanged despite the weeks of separation, that he continued respecting her need for time and space, and that whenever she felt ready, regardless of how long that process required, he would welcome the opportunity to speak with her again about whatever future they might build together, obstacles and complications notwithstanding. Alara read the letter several times, sitting alone in her small room above Bates' stable, tears gathering in her eyes as she processed the weight of his words. She had spent the past month building a genuinely satisfying independent life, proving to herself that she could thrive entirely on her own merits, without needing validation from anyone, including a duke who had once warned her away from exactly the kind of ambition she had since demonstrated so thoroughly. But independence, she realized as she folded the letter carefully and tucked it away, did not necessarily mean isolation. She had proven to herself that she could survive and even flourish without him, that her worth existed entirely separate from his acceptance or rejection. That knowledge, hard-won through weeks of difficult but ultimately rewarding work, gave her a new kind of clarity regarding her own feelings, one unclouded by desperation or fear of losing something she could not survive without. She genuinely cared for him, she realized. Not because she needed his position or his wealth, not because becoming a duchess represented some ultimate achievement she had secretly been chasing all along, but because during their months together, she had glimpsed a version of him that few others were permitted to see, a man capable of genuine vulnerability and growth beneath his carefully constructed walls of authority and control. Over the following weeks, Elara continued building her life in Ashford, her stable work expanding steadily as her reputation grew throughout the surrounding region. She corresponded occasionally with the Duke, their letters gradually growing warmer and more personal as trust slowly rebuilt itself across the distance separating them. She learned more about his childhood, about the weight of responsibility that had settled onto his shoulders too early following his father's death, about the loneliness that had driven him to construct such rigid boundaries around his own emotions. In turn, she shared stories of her own life in Ashford, her growing friendship with Bate, the satisfaction of building something entirely her own through honest work and genuine skill. Their correspondence became a strange kind of courtship, conducted entirely through careful, thoughtful letters rather than the grand gestures typically associated with romance among nobility. And Elara found herself genuinely treasuring this slower, more deliberate way of coming to know someone's true character. Nearly 2 months after her departure from Ashcombe Manor, Elara received word that the Duchess Dowager had fallen seriously ill, her condition worsening rapidly enough that the household staff feared the worst. The news arrived through a hurried letter from Nora, who had maintained their friendship despite the distance, and Elara felt her heart clench with genuine grief and concern for the woman who had shown her such unexpected kindness during her time at the estate. Without hesitation, Elara arranged for someone to cover her responsibilities at Bates' stable and prepared immediately to travel back toward Ashcombe Manor, uncertain what she would find upon arrival, uncertain how the Duke would receive her sudden return, but entirely certain that she could not remain away while the woman who had believed in her so genuinely might be facing her final days. As she packed her few belongings once more, this time for an entirely different kind of journey, Elara reflected on how dramatically her circumstances had shifted since that cold morning she had ridden away from the estate, wrapped in her father's coat, uncertain of anything except her need for distance and clarity. She had found both, along with an unexpected independence and self-assurance that no title or position could have provided. Now, riding back toward the very place she had once fled, she carried with her a clearer understanding of her own worth, and a genuine hope, however cautious, regarding whatever future might still be possible between herself and the man who had once warned her against exactly this kind of hope. The journey back to Ashcombe Manor felt entirely different from the one Elara had taken away from it 2 months earlier. Where that earlier ride had carried the weight of uncertainty and quiet heartbreak, this journey carried urgency and genuine fear, her thoughts consumed with worry for the Duchess Dowager, rather than the complicated romantic tension that had once dominated her thoughts so completely. She arrived at the estate late in the evening, the familiar silhouette of the main house rising against a darkening sky, and found the household in a state of hushed anxiety that confirmed her worst fears about the severity of the Duchess's condition. Mrs. Prout met her at the entrance, her usually composed expression etched with genuine worry. "Miss Whitmore," she said, relief clearly evident in her voice despite the circumstances. "Thank goodness you have come. The Duchess has been asking for you, between her more difficult moments." "How is she?" Alara asked, following the housekeeper quickly through familiar hallways toward the Duchess's private quarters. "The physicians are uncertain," Mrs. Prude admitted. "Her heart has weakened considerably these past weeks. We fear the worst, though she has surprised us with her resilience before." They reached the Duchess's bedroom, and Alara found the older woman propped against a mountain of pillows, looking considerably frailer than she remembered, her once vibrant complexion now pale and drawn. The Duke sat in a chair beside the bed, his exhausted expression suggesting he had barely left his mother's side in days. He looked up as Alara entered, and something complicated flashed across his features, relief and hope and lingering uncertainty all tangled together in a single glance. "Alara," he said quietly, rising from his chair, "thank you for coming." "Of course," she said simply, moving past him toward the Duchess's bedside without hesitation. "How are you feeling, my lady?" The Duchess's eyes fluttered open, and a weak but genuine smile spread across her lined face. "There you are," she murmured. "I told them you would come despite everything." "I would never abandon you, my lady, regardless of the circumstances," Alara said, taking the older woman's frail hand gently in her own. "I have missed our morning walks," the Duchess said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And your stubborn refusal to simply agree with everything I say." "I have missed them too," Alara admitted, tears gathering in her eyes despite her efforts to remain composed for the Duchess's sake. Over the following days, Alara remained at the estate, helping care for the Duchess alongside the physicians and household staff, her presence seeming to provide genuine comfort to the ailing woman during her most difficult moments. The Duke remained close throughout, and slowly, gradually, the careful distance that had existed between himself and Alara since her departure began dissolving naturally, replaced by a shared concern and quiet cooperation that reminded them both of the connection they had built during those earlier months together. One evening, nearly a week after Alara's return, as the Duchess finally began showing genuine signs of improvement, stabilizing enough that the physicians allowed themselves cautious optimism, Alara found herself alone with the Duke in the Manor's gardens, both of them finally able to breathe more easily after days of anxious vigilance. "Thank you," he said quietly, as they walked slowly along the familiar paths where his mother had once shared so many stories with Alara during their morning walks, "for coming back, despite everything that happened between us." "I could not stay away, knowing she needed me," Alara said honestly, "regardless of our own complicated circumstances." "And now that she is recovering," he asked carefully, "what does that mean for you? Will you return to Ashford, to the life you have built there?" Alara considered the question seriously, aware of how much had changed within herself during their months apart. "I do not know yet," she admitted. "I have built something genuinely satisfying in Ashford, an independence and self-respect I am not certain I am willing to simply abandon." "I would never ask you to abandon that," the Duke said quickly. "Whatever independence you have built for yourself, whatever confidence and skill you have earned through your own efforts, those qualities are precisely what drew me to you in the first place. I have no interest in a version of you that exists only to serve my expectations or my family's rank." "Then what exactly are you asking?" Alara said, stopping to face him directly beneath the pale winter moonlight. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring, far less ostentatious than she might have expected from someone of his rank and wealth. "I am asking," he said quietly, "whether you might consider building a life alongside me, not as someone who erases her own independence to fit into my world, but as someone who challenges and strengthens me precisely because she refuses to simply accept the boundaries others insist upon. I love you, Alara, not despite your stubbornness and independence, but because of it. I was wrong, that first day in the stable, to warn you against ambitions you had not even voiced. You have taught me, through everything that has happened since, that the only warnings truly worth heeding are the ones that guide us toward genuine growth, rather than the ones that keep us trapped within comfortable but ultimately hollow boundaries. Tears streamed freely down Alara's cheeks as she listened to his words, months of uncertainty and heartache finally resolving into a clarity she had not fully believed possible. "Lucinda and others like her will never fully accept me," she said softly, though her voice carried more determination than doubt now. "They will continue whispering, continue searching for opportunities to remind everyone of my origins." "Let them," the Duke said firmly. "I have spent enough years allowing fear of others' judgment to dictate my choices. I am done doing so, particularly regarding something this important. Whatever difficulties arise, we will face them together, as equals, regardless of what anyone else believes about where you were born or what rank you were meant to occupy." Alara looked down at the ring, then back up into his gray eyes, filled now with genuine hope and vulnerability rather than the cold authority that had once defined their earliest interactions. "You once told me I would never be a duchess," she said, a small, knowing smile beginning to spread across her face. "I did," he acknowledged, matching her smile with one of his own, rare and genuine. "And I have never been more grateful to have been so completely wrong about anything in my entire life." "Then perhaps," Alara said, extending her hand toward him, "it is time we proved that warning wrong together." He slipped the ring onto her finger with careful, reverent hands, and when he finally kissed her, gently and completely beneath the winter moonlight, Alara felt every lingering doubt and fear dissolve entirely, replaced by a genuine certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would face them not as a stable hand's daughter reaching desperately beyond her station, but as a woman who had earned her place through her own strength, skill, and unwavering refusal to accept limitations others tried to impose upon her. Their engagement, when announced formally weeks later, sent shockwaves through the region's nobility, exactly as both of them had anticipated. Lucinda's attempts to stir scandal and doubt continued for a time, though her influence gradually diminished as more of the household and surrounding community witnessed firsthand the genuine partnership developing between the Duke and his unconventional bride, one built on mutual respect and shared strength rather than rigid adherence to outdated expectations regarding rank and birth. The Duchess Dowager, recovering steadily from her illness, insisted on personally overseeing many of the wedding preparations, delighted beyond measure at the match her own instincts had, in some ways, helped orchestrate from the very beginning. "I told you," she reminded her son during one particularly busy afternoon of preparations, "that warnings often reveal more about fear than truth. I am pleased you finally learned to listen to your own heart rather than your own anxieties." Alara, meanwhile, continued maintaining her connection to Ashford, arranging for Bates' stable operations to continue thriving under new management, while establishing plans for a similar venture near Ashcombe Manor itself, determined that her marriage would not require abandoning the independent skills and identity she had worked so hard to build during their months apart. On the day of their wedding, as Alara walked through the same gardens where he had once proposed, wearing a gown considerably grander than anything she had ever imagined wearing during her earliest days working in the stables, she caught sight of old Callum standing among the gathered witnesses, her father's coat, the very one she had worn riding away at dawn all those months earlier, folded carefully over his arm. "I thought you might want this nearby today," he said quietly, as she approached him before the ceremony began. "Your father would be prouder than words could ever properly express." Alara touched the worn fabric gently, memories of that difficult morning flooding back, the uncertainty and fear she had carried away from this very estate, the independence and clarity she had found through the difficult journey that followed. "Thank you, Callum," she said softly, tears gathering once more, though these carried nothing but genuine joy and gratitude, "for everything you have done from the very beginning." As the ceremony began, and Alara walked toward the man who had once warned her against exactly this future, she felt not the triumph of proving him wrong, but something far more meaningful, the quiet satisfaction of having built, through her own strength and determination, a life entirely her own, one where love and independence existed not in opposition, but in genuine, hard-won harmony. The warning he had once offered her, delivered so coldly in a stable on an ordinary morning, had ultimately led them both toward exactly the future neither of them had believed possible when it was first spoken. And as they exchanged their vows beneath the same winter sky that had witnessed her departure months earlier, both of them understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that some warnings exist not to prevent our dreams, but simply to test how genuinely we are willing to fight for them. A full year passed before the true test of their marriage arrived, one that neither the wedding vows nor the quiet victory over Lucinda's cruelty had fully prepared them for. The Regional Council, a gathering of the area's most influential noble families, announced its annual assembly, a formal event where matters of land, trade, and political alliance were settled among the region's most powerful figures. Attendance was mandatory for any duke wishing to maintain influence over local affairs, and for the first time, Alara would attend not as a companion or a curiosity, but as the Duchess of Ashcombe herself, standing beside her husband in a room filled with people who had spent months questioning whether she deserved that title at all. She spent the weeks leading up to the assembly studying trade agreements, tenant disputes, and the delicate history between neighboring estates, determined that no one would ever again suggest she lacked the understanding required for her new position. Riston, watching her pore over documents late into the evening by candlelight, found himself continually amazed by how thoroughly she approached every challenge placed before her, never satisfied with simply appearing capable, always determined to genuinely earn her place through knowledge and effort. "You do not need to memorize every clause in every agreement," he told her one night, gently closing the heavy ledger she had been studying. "Nobody expects that level of mastery from you." "I expect it from myself," Alara replied simply. "I refuse to stand in that room and rely solely on your reputation to protect me. I want them to respect my own understanding, earned through my own effort, exactly as I earned everything else in my life." He kissed her forehead softly, pride evident in every line of his expression. "Then I will simply enjoy watching you prove them all wrong once again." The assembly itself proved every bit as challenging as Alara had anticipated. Lucinda attended as well, her sharp tongue as ready as ever, though her attempts to undermine Alara's credibility grew increasingly desperate as the day progressed, particularly after Alara demonstrated a thorough command of a complicated water rights dispute between two neighboring estates, offering a practical solution that impressed even the most skeptical nobles in attendance. "How does a stable hand's daughter come to understand irrigation agreements so thoroughly?" one older lord asked, not entirely unkindly, more genuinely curious than dismissive. "The same way anyone learns anything worth knowing," Alara replied with practiced calm, "through careful study and genuine effort. I did not become Duchess by inheriting knowledge through birth, my lord. I earned it the same way I earned everything else." Her answer, delivered with quiet confidence rather than defensive anger, seemed to shift something in the room's general perception. And by the time the assembly concluded, whispers of grudging respect had begun replacing the earlier skepticism that had greeted her arrival. Lucinda, sensing the tide turning irreversibly against her efforts to diminish Alara's standing, eventually retreated into sullen silence, her influence over the family's opinion permanently diminished. That evening, riding home together through the quiet countryside, Riston reached across the space between their horses and took Alara's hand gently in his own. "I am proud of you," he said simply, "more than words can properly express." "We did that together," Alara replied, squeezing his hand affectionately. "Just as we have faced everything else together since that morning, I rode away in my father's coat." Their partnership continued strengthening over the following months, as Alara established her long-planned stable venture near Ashcombe Manor, training horses not only for the estate's own use, but for surrounding farms and traveling merchants who quickly recognized her exceptional skill. She hired several young women from the surrounding villages, teaching them the same patient, careful techniques her father had once taught her, creating opportunities for other women whose circumstances might otherwise have limited their prospects considerably. The Duchess Dowager, fully recovered from her earlier illness, took immense pleasure in watching her daughter-in-law build something genuinely meaningful within the estate's broader community, often joining Alara during her morning training sessions, offering commentary and encouragement despite having little practical experience with horses herself. "You have transformed this place," the Duchess observed one bright spring morning, watching Alara work patiently with a young mare that had arrived skittish and fearful only weeks earlier. "Not simply through marriage, but through everything you have built since arriving here, first as a companion, now as Duchess." "I could not have built any of it alone," Alara replied honestly. "Your kindness from the very beginning gave me the opportunity to prove myself. I remain grateful for that every single day." Word of Alara's unconventional background and her husband's willingness to disregard traditional expectations regarding rank and marriage gradually spread throughout the wider region, inspiring quiet conversations among other young women who had similarly been told their circumstances limited their possibilities. Several tenant families, whose daughters had shown particular skill or ambition, began approaching Alara directly, seeking her guidance regarding opportunities they might never have previously considered pursuing. Riston, meanwhile, found his own approach to managing the estate shifting considerably under Alara's influence, becoming more willing to listen to voices previously excluded from decision-making processes, more attentive to the genuine needs and concerns of tenants and staff, rather than simply the expectations of his fellow nobility. The estate flourished under their combined leadership, its reputation growing not simply for wealth or prestige, but for a kind of fairness and opportunity increasingly rare among the region's other great houses. 2 years after their wedding, Alara gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Miriam, after the Duchess Dowager, whose early kindness had made everything that followed possible. The old woman wept openly upon holding her granddaughter for the first time, declaring with characteristic bluntness that the child would undoubtedly inherit her mother's stubborn refusal to accept boundaries others tried imposing upon her. "Good," Riston said, watching his wife hold their daughter with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. "The world could use considerably more people willing to challenge warnings that exist only to protect comfortable but ultimately limiting assumptions." As their daughter grew, Alara made certain she understood the full story of her parents' unconventional beginning, the warning issued in a stable so many years earlier, the masquerade and its painful exposure, the difficult months of separation and independent growth, and finally, the return and reconciliation that had ultimately proven every dismissive assumption wrong. She wanted Miriam to understand, from her earliest years, that circumstances of birth need never determine the full scope of what someone might eventually achieve, provided they possessed sufficient courage and determination to keep reaching, regardless of how many warnings the world offered against such ambition. Old Callum, now considerably more frail, but still occasionally visiting the stables to offer advice and stories from his decades of experience, took particular delight in teaching young Miriam the same patient techniques he had once taught her mother, delighted to watch a new generation carry forward the skills and values that had shaped Alara's own remarkable journey. "Your mother rode away from this very stable, wearing her grandfather's coat, believing she might never return," he told Miriam one afternoon, as the child watched wide-eyed while he demonstrated proper horse care techniques. She did not know at the time that she was riding toward exactly the life she was always meant to have, simply by a different path than anyone expected. Alara, overhearing this conversation from nearby, felt her heart swell with a familiar mixture of gratitude and quiet pride. The warning that had once threatened to define the limits of her existence had instead become the very foundation upon which she had built a life far richer and more meaningful than she could have imagined during those early, uncertain days as a simple stable hand's daughter. Years later, when Miriam herself grew old enough to face her own challenges and doubts, uncertain whether her own ambitions and dreams might prove too bold for the circumstances of her birth, Alara would remind her, with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through every difficulty she had faced. That warnings meant to limit possibility often revealed far more about the fears of those issuing them than any genuine truth about what someone might ultimately achieve. "Your father once told me I would never become a duchess," she told her daughter during one such conversation, years after that cold morning ride that had changed the course of both their lives forever. "He believed, at the time, that he was protecting me from disappointment. Instead, he was simply revealing his own fear of caring for someone deeply enough to risk genuine vulnerability. I chose, that morning, to ride away rather than accept a limitation I had never truly believed in myself. And in doing so, I discovered a strength and independence that ultimately made everything that followed possible, including the very title he once insisted I would never hold." Miriam listened carefully, absorbing the lesson her mother offered with the same thoughtful attention that had characterized Alara's own approach to every challenge throughout her remarkable journey. And as she grew into adulthood, eventually facing her own share of warnings and limitations imposed by a world still slow to fully accept women determined to forge their own paths, she carried forward the same quiet, unshakable confidence her mother had demonstrated so many years earlier in a simple stable, standing before an injured horse and a dismissive duke who had, against every expectation, eventually come to recognize her true worth. The estate of Ashcombe continued flourishing for generations following Alara and Riston's unconventional union, its reputation for fairness and opportunity becoming something of a model for other noble houses throughout the region, gradually beginning to reconsider their own rigid adherence to outdated expectations regarding rank and birth. And though the specific details of that first encounter between a stable hand's daughter and a warning duke eventually faded into the realm of family legend, softened and embellished slightly with each retelling across the years, the fundamental truth at its heart remained perfectly, powerfully intact. Some warnings, however sincerely offered, exist not as unchangeable prophecy, but simply as an invitation for those brave enough to accept the challenge, to prove, through patient effort and unwavering determination, exactly how wrong such limiting assumptions can ultimately prove to be.